majority of the membership of the UN are actually small states. But we have to be very careful to speak about small. And I learned that I'm not saying anymore that we are a small state. I'm always saying that we are a smaller state. And the reason is that, you have countries like Luxembourg, you have Pacific Island states or Caribbean states which have much less people, but it doesn't mean that their impact or the influence of what is happening in the world is smaller.
Welcome everyone to this new episode of The Next Page, the podcast of UN Geneva Library and Archives designed to advance the conversation on multilateralism. We are in one of those episodes dedicated to permanent representatives of member states to the UN here in Geneva, and I have the great pleasure and honor to have in the studio with me today the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Slovakia in the UN, Ambassador Dušan Matulay. So, first of all, welcome to you, Ambassador, and thank you for taking the time. We know you've been permanent representative to the UN for Slovakia since September 2021. And prior to this appointment in Geneva, you have been serving as Director General for Economic Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in your country. And at some point in your career, you were also posted in New York at the United Nations, where you were deputy permanent representative. So again, welcome, and please, introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself, how you became a diplomat and how you became a permanent representative for your country to the UN.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the kind invitation. I appreciate this opportunity to present my country and the ambitions and goals of Slovakia in the UN and in global affairs. Me, myself, my career has been closely linked to the ministry for 30 years. I started my diplomatic career in 1992. My background is in journalism and political sciences. I pretty much started my diplomatic career in the context of dissolution of Czechoslovakia, when Slovakia was building its foreign service, where I started pretty much very soon after 93. I started 92, but 93 I basically transferred to the Slovak foreign service. My kind of first love and first posting was in Germany, because German is pretty much my first foreign language, where I started working as a press attaché and worked my career ladder, so to say, throughout the 30 years up to the current positions. I served, among others, in Russia, in New York, in Ireland, and right now I am here in Geneva. In between, in the headquarters, I went through many different departments and specializations. I worked as the head of the press department. I was the director of the analytical and planning department, and indeed, my last capacity was Director General for Economic Cooperation, which, by the way, has a lot of interlinks also with the agendas which I'm covering here in Geneva.
Let's begin with Slovakia as a country. Slovakia has a very long history, a very fascinating history. Its very name reminds us of the geographic expansion of the Slavic population starting back in the 5th century in the heart of Europe, where, the country that is now Slovakia was basically the center of the Samos Empire at that time. So for those who really have no idea, never been to Slovakia, I wonder how you would present Slovakia and maybe what are the key moments of the history of Slovakia.
Well, Slovakia is a young country. We are 30 years old. Slovakia as an independent state exists from the 1st of January 1993 as a result of peaceful dissolution of Czechoslovakia. But we are an old nation, so we are a young country, but an old nation. Indeed, as you rightly said, the Slavs and the Slavic tribes have been in Europe and in this region from around the 5th century. But I think that I don't want to go through the long and ancient history. I think that the most important modern part of the Slovak history is the establishment of the common state of Slovaks and Czechs, the Czechoslovak Republic in 1918 as a result of the First World War. And then certainly the so-called tender or Velvet Revolution in 1989, when the Czechs and Slovaks said no to the communist regime and started to build up their democratic society. And then obviously 1993, when Slovakia started its individual journey in global affairs and in this world.
When you look at this concept of old nation and young state, and we take, for example, as you said, we could take 1918 as the resurgence of the idea of state of Slovakia after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Since then, Slovakia has been at the center of a very dynamic part of Europe that has gone through constant transformation and tensions and reorganizations from the time of the Soviet Union, the time of the European Union, etc. So I really wonder, what is the place of Slovakia in the region now today from a political and even strategic point of view? And what can be said about, this living together with European countries in the very heart of modern Europe?
Politically, we are a member of the EU and NATO, and that defines our European and transatlantic identity. The membership in both organizations brought us back, so to say, to family of nations where we always belonged based on our values, our history, but from which we were torn away not by our own decision. So this is the political or the strategic framework. And geographically, as you can see on the map, we are a landlocked country at the very heart of Europe. Some geographers claim that the very center of Europe actually is in Slovakia, in a small village in central Slovakia called Krahule. That probably depends where you define the most eastern part of Europe, because the northern, southern and western part are pretty clear. But this discussion probably might turn into more political and philosophical than geographic contemplation. The fact is that we are in the center, and whichever army marched somewhere in Europe, it had to go almost certainly through Slovakia, and that shapes the country to some extent too. Regionally, we are a Central European state, Mittel Europa. In the fantasy world of Tolkien, we would be probably Middle Earth. It is certainly a very historically complex region with various views which many times divide us. We could have a long and unproductive conversation about the same term. I used Mittel Europa, and that's why I tried also in the beginning to avoid to slip too deep into the history. There is a famous saying of Churchill that a nation that forgets its past has no future, and that is true, and we do remember our history. We were a part of different geopolitical constellation, which are part of our cultural and historic heritage. But I also think that it shouldn't be the basis of the relations of today, because I'm also convinced that a nation which lives in the history has no future either. If you live with your real or alleged injustices, grievances, that is not really forward-looking, because the history was written. We want to live the present and shape the future. And the snapshot of the reality of today is that we have friendly relations with all our neighboring countries. We have a very good cooperation. The only tragic, troubled situation which we have is on our eastern border with Ukraine due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. A tragedy not of our or Ukrainian making. And it is heartbreaking to see that instead of developing all forms of cooperation, we are confronted daily with flows of refugees, mostly vulnerable people, children and women. Slovakia reacted as a good neighbor and has helped the neighboring country, Ukraine. We opened not only the borders, but more importantly, our hearts. And I really feel proud to see the spontaneous demonstration of solidarity and humanity. We will continue helping as long as necessary.
When we look at the trajectory of Slovakia in the UN, you said it, Slovakia is 30 years old, and it became a member of the United Nations right from the beginning in 1993. So actually this year, you're celebrating 30 years of membership with the UN, which is quite a nice milestone. 30 years is not as long as the UN has been alive, but it's very long. And it's 30 years that have seen major transformations in your region of the world, not to mention the rest of the world. So I was wondering whether you could already, as permanent representative, form an idea of an assessment of Slovakia's journey inside the UN as a system.
Well, I would maybe start with the very... how should I say, very roots of Slovakia's independence, and that was the peaceful dissolution of Czechoslovakia. In the early 90s, this was not something self-explanatory and common. We had many very difficult. We were observing, and we could see many very difficult developments, be it in the former Soviet Union or former Yugoslavia, where things went not peacefully, to say the least. And I think that this is an important thing, which is kind of like the DNA of Slovakia, peaceful solution, peaceful dissolution. As I said, 1989, when communism was defeated in Czechoslovakia, it was called Velvet or Tender Revolution. And the same way, the dissolution of Czechoslovakia was a velvet, peaceful, a tender divorce, if you want so. And in this sense, I think that this is the important DNA prerequisite with which Slovakia went into global affairs and into intergovernmental, interstate affairs, with the notion that things should be solved peacefully within the context of the multilateral diplomacy. As a smaller country, for us was clear from the get-go that we have to be integrated in the global networks. So the membership of the UN was a very clear and logical step to make. It was, by the way, to be concrete, the 19th of January. And what is interesting from the point of view in Geneva, the 19th of January 1993, that was the accession of Slovakia to the UN that happened in New York, obviously. But the membership and joining the other agencies followed. And from the point of view of Geneva, we basically celebrate the 30th anniversary in all the important agencies here in Geneva, be it WHO, be it, Human Rights Council didn't exist at that time in the form of today, but all the agencies which sit here, ILO, and you name them, ITU, WIPO, the membership of Slovakia in these agencies followed, and it was kind of like the clear understanding from the get-go that Slovakia as a smaller state must be a part of the global cooperation, of the global structures. After UN, obviously, other international organizations followed. The most important integrational achievements of Slovakia were that we joined the EU and NATO in 2004. By the way, interestingly, Slovakia was the first country of the former Comecon which introduced euro, and still we are one of the few in our Central European region. Actually, the only one, to be precise. If I take Austria out and stay with our neighbors Czechia, Poland, and Hungary, we are the only one who has euro as a currency, so the European currency. So integration, that was and multilateral diplomacy was the framework where Slovakia saw itself from the get-go, and this has been a consensus practically since the start.
When you look at where we are now in the history of international relations and the history of the journey of the UN, and I'm referring to the now impending SDG summit, referring to the last two reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So these two big priorities on the international scene, development, sustainable development, truly sustainable development for the future, and what we now clearly call openly a climate crisis. When you look at that as a permanent representative of a small country, what is your main concern as a member state to the UN and part of this integrated Central European ensemble of countries with regard to these big agenda items? How do you view them?
Let me help myself here with the sport terminology. Sport has been an important and integral part of my life. I used to play volleyball, and the main wisdom is, and it's probably the main wisdom of all collective sports, you are only as good as your weakest player in the field. And the situation in global affairs, I think, is quite similar. We, the global world, the UN, if you want so, are one team, and the challenges are the opponent. So we can tackle the big global issues only if we act inclusive, with respect to each other, and in solidarity. The more global the world gets, the more interconnected we are, the more we must cooperate. I mean, no big state can shoulder the challenges of today, no matter how big, mighty, and powerful it is, let alone the smaller states. So, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that you can't create a hermetically closed bubble or impenetrable fortress. Acting together was the only way to get the disease under control. So we must act in solidarity, respect universality of rules, seek sustainable solutions, regardless of size, economic, military, or whatever power or feature. I know it sounds very generic, but big things are in a sense generic.
I wanted to circle back to this this idea that probably is a value for Slovakia in international relations, this kind of peaceful solution, peaceful dissolution. And clearly, in the case of the Czechoslovakia state dissolution, this was it worked very well. We could see, as international relations observers, that clearly both the Czech and the Slovak parties were intent on seeking the best peaceful solution. Going back to what the role of Slovakia is in the big world of international relations now, I wonder if there are other ways in which this value is promoted by Slovakia, other ways in which, for example, you as a foreign service, all the diplomats of your country are perhaps using this value, if not the skill, to actually bring this kind of bit of your own wisdom into the game, which is, there are solutions that don't need to pass through phases of conflict or even armed conflict. Is this really working like that? Is a value for your country? Is something that is present in the minds of diplomats around the world?
I do think so, but let me say it this way. Smaller countries have limited capacities. They can't be everywhere and cover everything. We have to look for niches and bring up things where we have the experience, the expertise. We have to be creative, maybe more creative. We have to build coalitions, seek partners. But at the end, never forget that at the end, only you are the master of your own fate. At the end, you are on your own. And you mentioned the peaceful dissolution, but there is life after any peaceful solution or dissolution. We got our 3 minutes of applause, but then the reality hit us and we were on our own. No special treatment or some carte blanche, some credit of trust. The process itself, the process towards independent Slovakia, was met with a lot of skepticism by many important partners, to say the least. So the life of the new state and in the new state was not exactly idyllic. Slovakia had to build a completely new state, new institutions. Czechoslovakia was a centralized state with all state institutions in Prague, and we were starting from scratch. In parallel, we were still confronted with a massive transformation, the transition from communist economy to a modern market economy, which would be competitive and functioning in the global world. For instance, the early 90s brought in Slovakia and Czechia a very new phenomenon which we didn't know before, that like unemployment. The communist system was known for artificial employment, and all of a sudden people found themselves unemployed. As you know, Czechoslovakia was a part of the so-called Comecon, which was pretty much the anti-EU, the integrational framework of the Soviet Empire. This all collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s. The production was ineffective, was outdated. We lost markets, the division of labor between the collapsing Eastern European states was collapsing obviously as well. So this was the economic struggle, and the third struggle was political. The 90s in Slovakia were also about the political struggle. The building of the democratic institutions and processes was a fight for the very essence and nature of our state and of our democracy. And this was a very painful process, and with very little or practically no help from abroad. We had to master it with a lot of our own tears and our own sweat. And we offer this experience and know-how to our partners in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, because this is a unique experience, wisdom, as you called it, which we think is authentic, valuable, and we want to share it with interested partners.
This is indeed incredible to have in the last 30 years gone through the experience of actually building institutions, resilient institutions, building...
Including the diplomatic service, for instance.
Including the diplomatic service, building democratic institutions and giving citizens, what they expect, what they need after such a great moment of destabilization. These are things that in Europe, apart from the former Soviet Union countries, date back centuries. So it is indeed a great asset as well, because it's fresh in the institutional memory of the country. It can be offered to other countries. We should not forget that the UN membership is made in majority of small countries.
That's correct.
Small countries are the largest number in our world. And so one thing that could be interesting for our audience is to hear from you what it means to be a small country in the UN today. It means being part of a majority, and you can leverage this majority for the priorities of these countries. It means being confronted with great powers, it means feeling alone or feeling vulnerable. How is it to be a small member state?
This is a very good question. I would say that the basic instinct of small countries is to be around the table and not on the menu. And I dare to say that the multilateral system with universal rules is exactly the structure which should avoid it, at least to the maximal possible level. Because this was a big part of the Czechoslovak history, tragic history, especially throughout the 20th century. Decisions about us were taken without us. Take, for instance, the Munich Agreement from 1938. It's well known is the occupation of the so-called Sudetenland by Hitler's Germany. But for instance, it's little known that the tragic consequence didn't end up just with this occupation, but also in an occupation of large parts of today's Slovakia by Hungary, based on equally shameful international plot called the Vienna Arbitration. In English, it's also sometimes called the Vienna Award. So in a sense, the revanchism, the misuse of the minorities and destruction of the peace architecture after World War was awarded. And I must say that the analogies with the Russian aggression in Ukraine today are quite terrifying. So we should have these mementos in mind, and that's probably the quintessence of Churchill's quote, which I mentioned earlier, not to forget your own history. But we shouldn't build on that. That shouldn't be the base for today. And not only negative mementos must be remembered. And this brings me to the point where I have to mention that actually today is our national holiday, where we celebrate the Slovak national uprising against fascism from 1944. It was one of the largest, if not the largest, military operation behind the front lines. And we want to project these positive mementos into our identity. This is part of our values. This is our narrative. This is what Slovakia wants to be, what Slovakia aspires to, how Slovakia wants to act in the multilateral diplomacy, and what Slovakia wants to give to the world.
Unless we say it, our audience will never know that we are actually recording this conversation on 29 August. Today is 29 August. It just brought it up.
It's a coincidence. Yeah.
It's a coincidence, but this is a happy coincidence. So on behalf of all the secretariat here, I want to give you the biggest wishes.
Thank you very much.
And it makes this episode even more joyous. I'm very happy about that. You said something very important now. You said what Slovakia wants to give to the world. So Let's tell the audience what is that Slovakia wants to give to the world. What is the dream of Slovakia that you bring to the UN?
I come back to what you actually asked. What I also wanted to clarify. You very very accurately said that the majority of the membership of the UN are actually small states. But we have to be very careful to speak about small. And I learned that I am not saying anymore that we are a small state. I'm always saying that we are a smaller state. And the reason is that you have countries like Luxembourg, you have Pacific Island states or Caribbean states which have much less people, but it doesn't mean that their impact or the influence of what is happening in the world is smaller. Actually, interestingly, we have a forum of small states, which is an informal working platform for small states. If I'm not mistaken, the ceiling is 10 million. You have to be under 10 million people, and it doesn't mean that the small states should gang up against the big ones. That's not the idea behind. But as I said, you want to be around the table. Certainly, your influence and your capabilities are limited by your size and by where you are geographically. If you are, for instance, a Slovakia, a landlocked country, or if you are an island country, if you are a developing country, and so on and so on. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a voice. And these platforms, and especially this platform which I'm mentioning, the Forum of Small States, is a very useful place where states with very, very different features or economic power, of political system, of, religion or ethnical composition, where these countries meet and actually find that, well, certainly we can't agree about everything, but there are many things which we have in common, and we are trying to work there where we can move something together and where we can convince also the big ones that solutions have to kind of like be inclusive, and they should be good for big, medium, rich, poor, and so on and so on. So I think that should be, and that is the quintessence and the art of diplomacy, to achieve a balance and equilibrium between all the states, regardless of their size, religious, political, economic, or other shape and form, and so on.
When you speak about the Forum of Small States, FOSS, one could easily think you are speaking of the UN. This process of recognizing the differences and the unity beyond the differences is typical of international institutions, the way the UN presents itself to the world. However, the game in the UN is a little bit more complex.
True.
Right? So that's why there is a need for FOSS, because if that wasn't the case, then FOSS wouldn't be that, precious to its members. So I wonder, always for the benefit of our audience, if the game at the UN is a little bit more complex than what you experience in the Forum of Small States, then how a small state or a state, any state, can make itself useful in the UN today? How do you go about upholding multilateralism on one hand and being careful that you don't end up on the menu on the other hand?
Well, this is not only a question for the UN. We have many regional organizations, integrational structures which have their own dynamics and diversities. And at the end, it is about seeking the common denominator on the best platform you have at your disposal. A level of diversity is everywhere. Take the EU, which might seem to many listeners to be a very homogeneous and compact block of states. But the motto of the EU is actually united in diversity. So the diversity within the EU is not only a fact, we embrace this fact, and despite the diversities, we are able to come up with workable and good solutions, such as single market, Schengen area, euro, the common European currency. And I think that should be the quintessence and ambition of any international organization, integrational grouping or platform of cooperation. I mean, the UN is the universal umbrella of multilateral diplomacy, and all the other forms of international cooperation reflect on some specific commonalities or other specificities. We mentioned the FOSS on the size, for instance, other organization on geographical proximity, some of the organization on religious aspects, etc. And this in some sense reminds me to one of the cornerstones and main principles of the cooperation within the EU. It's the so-called subsidiarity principle, by the way, a German invention, Germans known for the efficiency. It pretty much rules out an intervention when an issue can be dealt with more effectively by the states themselves at national, regional, local, or whichever level. Because in the end, and that's important to underscore, the states are the shareholders of the EU or any platform or international organization, and they must be the owners and masters of the processes.
I wonder if you, as we wrap up this episode, if you have some key message that you want to give to our audience, if there is, a Slovak value or a thought that you want to share that you want the audience to take with them.
I'm a fan of different proverbs and sayings. They encapsulate a lot of the wisdom and culture of every nation. And my favorite one in Slovak is, the more languages you speak, the more you are a human being, or the more times you are a human being. One, it reflects the small size of Slovakia. We speak a language which maybe some 7 million around the world speak. So we have a boutique language. So to speak other languages is a necessity. But the saying also highlights the openness and respect to other cultures. You want to speak to the world, you have to speak the language of your partner so the others understand. But it also hints something else. To speak the language and to understand each other are two different things. So you have to speak so the partner understands you, and you have to be able to listen and understand what your partner is telling you. I hope I didn't caught myself in too complicated construction. But in a nutshell, it says you have to be open, you must be willing and ready to communicate, to speak understandably, but also listen with understanding. So you have to show respect to your partner. Well, and in the end, that is pretty much the quintessence of diplomacy, or the art of diplomacy and the art of negotiations.
I think this is very powerful. It's a perfect way to conclude our conversation in this episode. Before thanking you, I want to say again our heartfelt wishes for this anniversary. We're not only on 29 August, we are on 29 August 2023, and so heartfelt wishes to you as a permanent representative, to your mission, and to everyone in Slovakia for a long membership in the United Nations. Ambassador Matulay, permanent representative of the Slovak Republic to the UN, thank you so much for taking the time, for being with us on the next page.
Thank you very much indeed.